there's a large group of Bitcoiners who have a different set of first principles. And that one of those first principles appears to be that a monetary network like Bitcoin should not have JPEGs on it. When Bitcoin started having JPEGs on it, it violated one of their first principles. So they had to work backwards to create a new line of rational thinking instead of reconsider that their first principle was wrong. I'll just say, I'm not a neutral party in this. I'm very opinionated, and I've been trying to cover it kind of neutrally, but I broke, Colin. I finally broke.
A man let loose.
Yeah, you can only say so many crazy things before I too take the gloves off. Okay, Colin, Satoshi himself has chimed in on the filter debate. Adam Back is in the ring.
There's shouting in the streets. People are angry about it. People want JPEGs off of their nodes. They want them off of their blockchain, not in my backyard. No inscriptions in my backyard. But it's an uphill battle. It doesn't really do anything. It's a Sisyphean struggle to try to make sure that things stay off of the blockchain when in reality they won't. But so we'll be getting into this episode. We'll be talking about the filter debate, which has really reached kind of a crescendo recently, what filtering is and what the pro filterers are trying to keep off of the blockchain in terms of arbitrary data. And then we'll be talking about why ultimately a lot of this doesn't really work out the way that it is put into when practice is taken off the paper. It doesn't really do well at all. So
yeah, and we're going to split this into two parts. The first part, I apologize, will probably be a lot of me monologuing, talking about forming the argument for why Bitcoin is censorship resistant and how this applies to filters. Then we'll try to inject some of our personality into it and riff on some of the wild characters and things which have been said and done out of this. But I'll just say, I'm not a neutral party in this. I'm very opinionated, and I've been trying to cover it kind of neutrally. But I broke, Colin. I finally broke. I've started.
A man let loose.
Yeah, you can only say so many crazy things before I too also take the gloves off. But and I'll also say, I'm going to be reductionist about some things. I'm going to hand wave about some things. And there are people who can go deep into the weeds on some of these, and I will not be able to cover everything. So let me give you an analogy, Colin. Yes, an analogy for the layperson. Let's imagine that I send you, Colin, a letter. And in this letter, I'm just telling you about how my day went and stuff and what I ate. And it appears like any normal letter to the outside reader. But what if I included an additional message within that letter? What if you knew, say, to read the first letter of every sentence, to read the real message within that letter? Let's imagine that there were an authority in the middle reading our correspondence, trying to figure out what the real message within those letters I'm sending you are. They could probably figure that out. They could be like, oh, it's a simple code. It's the first letter of each sentence. And they could start confiscating those letters so that I couldn't pass those along to you. But you and I could come up with increasingly elaborate schemes. We could take every letter, following pi, and have some weird kind of every other letter that follows a word that rhymes with Charlie. We could have those rules, and it would be difficult for the authority to decipher that message, and it'd be really difficult to do that. It basically means that it's disproportionately difficult for that authority to fully prevent us from including these extra messages. It's a cat and mouse game. This is an imperfect, but I think helpful analogy for describing this concept of arbitrary data, someone who doesn't know anything about code or isn't a dev. So while it's possible to limit simple forms and disincentivize it, it's an asymmetric game of eliminating it. Theoretically, as long as you can include any type of data, then you can't fully prevent arbitrary data. So this is an analogy when I for the non-technical person. I want to now move to one of my favorite narratives about Bitcoin. You want to say something?
Well, I would complicate that analogy when we get to if we touch on ocean pool at any point, and if we touch on template construction, filtering out these transactions, because I would also complicate that analogy to say, in this scenario, imagine if USPS wasn't the only carrier for sending your letters. You have FedEx and you have UPS and you have a bunch of other carriers that you can go through if you want to get your message across. So anyway.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example. I'm going to add that to my analogy. Okay, so let's go to one of like Bitcoiners' favorite like nation state game theory ideas, which is, let's say there's a country which wants to censor transactions. Let's imagine it's China and they want to prevent Chinese citizens from sending Bitcoin out of the country. So they know which addresses don't belong to Chinese citizens and they try to block those. Can China prevent these transactions? Well, they could try. They could try to enforce domestic pools or block producers to not include those transactions. They could try to, tell miners you can't build on chains with these transactions or include these transactions. They could tell domestic nodes not to relay these transactions. But the thing is, yes, they could try to do that, but it might only have the effect that it makes it a little more difficult and expensive to send. But the thing is that it would actually require a ton of asymmetry for China. They would actually have to control a supermajority of hash rate and blocks. They would have to control vast parts of Bitcoin, and it would still be very, very difficult because Bitcoin is designed to be censorship resistant. This is interesting because this is, I would say, one of the core concepts that Bitcoin maximalists have told ourselves about why Bitcoin is special, that no state can prevent this. This is why it is this like bearer asset, self-custodial, censorship resistant. With censorship resistant networks, we have this problem of spam. Spam is very difficult to define. As much as people will try to tell you there's a definition, there's really not a strong, good definition. An example of historical attempts to solve the spam problem are email, where email is very easy to send a bunch of messages to everyone. In fact, it's pretty much free. And so the spam prevention mechanisms on the email protocol basically meant that over time, email had to become permissioned by gatekeepers who basically decipher whether all these messages are spam or not. Bitcoin solved this using a mechanism called proof of work and the fee market. Proof of work is a concept which we attribute to many people, but often bring up Adam Back because he's referenced in the white paper for this. So Bitcoin's primary defense against spam is requiring users to pay a fee to send a transaction. This fee is calculated by two main components: how big your transaction is, like how much block space you want to use, and then estimation of how urgent you want that transaction to be. How soon do you want it to get into a block? The bigger or more complex, the bigger your transaction is, the higher the fee. And the more urgent the transaction is, the higher the fee. Bitcoin also has a limit of how much can fit into it. This is what we call the block size. So no matter what transactions go in, there is a hard cap on the total amount of data that we can put into a block. And that is roughly 4 megabytes right now. We fought a whole war over this. We call it the block size war. One of the things we did in the block size war is say that we're not going to commit to future block size increases. We're going to establish a cap at the consensus level so that we preserve the ability to run a node for everyone, because they're not having to spend a lot of money and resources to accommodate all of the data. We're going to put a cap on it. It's important to say that whatever the transactions look like, whether they're financial or whether they're entirely JPEGs, the amount of data that node runners have to store is capped at an upper limit of 4 megabytes per block, which comes out to about 250 gigabytes per year, which is not really that expensive. That might be like spending $100 per decade on a new hard drive. Where does arbitrary data come in? Because one type of arbitrary data are JPEGs or token schemes. And this is what's getting a lot of people angry these days. But this is an old conversation. This is an old argument that actually goes back. The most recent one, the famous one from history is from 2014 in the creation of op return. People were putting arbitrary data on Bitcoin, and they were actually routing around the public relay network, submitting these directly to miners. This is a good time to talk about policy versus consensus. There is a great thread by the user Orange Surf to talk about policy and consensus. I wrote about it in a previous Blockspace Media article last spring. I'd recommend you read it. But basically, imagine a Venn diagram of any transaction which is valid within Bitcoin. We call these consensus valid transactions. Then you have transactions which your node will relay, that is, pass along to the next node. And we call those standard transactions. Your client, whether you're running Bitcoin Core or Bitcoin Knots or another different Bitcoin client, may have certain default standardness rules. The Venn diagram is that valid transactions is a bigger circle. Standard transactions is a subset of those transactions. And sometimes we do not pass along transactions because your node may deem them harmful to the network or to itself. A good example would be denial of service vector, where your node gets blasted with a bunch of transactions, which make it really difficult to operate and can have toxic qualities in the network. These are actually somewhat well defined as a category. And so these are transactions that could go into Bitcoin. I've done a podcast with Portland Huddle about one of these, but the standard trend, the thing is, there are valid transactions which are neither standard nor DOS transactions. So we're talking about a big circle of valid transactions, a smaller circle of standard transactions, another circle within valid transactions called DOS transactions. And then there are transactions which have no category except they're valid. They're just not relayed. That is probably an imperfect and confusing explanation because it's really nuanced and difficult to explain. So I apologize, but I got to get through this. So
I think the basic idea, though, is that there are transactions that the Bitcoin network will recognize as valid if you can get them to a miner. And then there are transactions that nodes will not relay because they do not conform to the node's relay policy, but they may be valid.
Yeah.
And that'll be important for when we get into, like knots versus core and different filters and stuff.
Yeah. So the thing is, as a rule of thumb, Bitcoin as a network is designed to function better for everyone, especially node operators, if the types of transactions which get into blocks are also the types of transactions which are relayed. The network itself deteriorates when you have a disparity between transactions which make it into blocks and transactions which your node sees. Everybody's happier. You are happier when your node sees all the transactions and has a very transparent view of what the Bitcoin network looks like. When this declines, the value of your node decreases to you because you can no longer reliably estimate what's going on Bitcoin. It makes it more difficult for you as a node runner, send transactions. It also is more resource intensive for your node. So as we think about what Bitcoin should look like, sometimes we have to adjust relay policy because transactions are not being publicly broadcast through the publicly available node network. Why would a transaction not be publicly broadcast? Sometimes it's profitable for miners to just take transactions that are sent to them directly. Or I sign a transaction and I hand that code, that hex, to a pool. There's a number of reasons I might do this, but the predominant reason is that it's difficult for me to publicly broadcast this transaction, but I'm willing to pay for it to be on Bitcoin. When a transaction of this type has enough economic demand, we've seen empirically, and we also can validate this theoretically, that it will make it into a block one way or another, either being publicly broadcast or by direct submission. If these start being submitted directly to miners, this is bad. It deteriorates the overall network topology, and it results in a toxic behavior overall of direct transaction submission.
Hey, Will here with Blockspace Media. Did you know that we have individual feeds for all our shows? If you're watching the Mining Pod, Bitcoin Season 2, or the Court Show, be sure to check out the individual feeds. You can find them on your podcast player of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Just type in Blockspace Media and you'll find all our shows pop up, or just type in the individual show name like the Mining Pod or Bitcoin Season 2. Be sure to hit that subscribe and give us a 5-star rating so we can continue to bring you the best content in Bitcoin.
Luckily, we have a limit up on how much toxic behavior can happen. These are the block size and the fee market. So we have a new transaction type of JPEGs. And it's really not a new transaction type. It's just kind of a different looking transaction. These are transactions with a lot of arbitrary data in them. You remember my analogy at the top, they look like normal transactions, but you can decode them to produce other things, such as JPEGs or token schemes. There is this claim that having these JPEGs on your node, after they get into a block and go on your node, there's this claim that they are bad for your node. And unfortunately, I think this is a pretty inaccurate claim and pretty broad misconception. Why could they be bad for your node? Well, the general claim is that they make it more difficult to run a node. How exactly? Post-ordinals, post-February 2023, blocks on Bitcoin went from not always being full at 4 megabytes, but sometimes being full. They went then after that to almost always being the maximum size they could be according to Bitcoin consensus of 4 megabytes. So this means that there's just more data that your node has to download every time a block hits. But there's a cap on that, which is 4 megabytes every block. Here is a question which I will ask you, Colin, in the form of a joke. What weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of gold? The answer is they weigh the same.
It's both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They weigh the same. They look and feel different, but they weigh the same. We can apply this analogy to Bitcoin blocks. A block can be full of what we know to be just monetary transactions, or it could be full of just JPEGs. It is still going to cost the same amount of bandwidth and time for your node to download those two. It is a general assumption that a successful adoption of Bitcoin looks like blocks being pretty full most of the time consistently. It is an assumption that Bitcoin blocks will be, on average, close to their max size as Bitcoin becomes more and more adopted. It is a kind of ridiculous point to say blocks should not be 4 megabytes. And so we, as a network, have made the assumption that this is always going to happen. So
can I steel man the other side?
Sure.
Because I think that what they would say is that the argument is not necessarily that each transaction isn't the same. I mean, they don't value the JPEG the same way they do economic transactions, but it's more that the JPEGs didn't exist at all, that demand wouldn't exist, and the block space would be available for financial transactions. So they see them as just totally invalid completely, and they're upset that they're taking up any space at all.
This is a structural criticism of Bitcoin in general. because I would reply, I feel that transactions of Americans to terrorist organizations are stealing block space away from people who want to make normal, good person transactions. Now you start to assign should and shouldn't to types of transactions. Bringing up my nation state analogy at the beginning, Bitcoin is designed so that you do not make moral judgments about the transactions because it is asymmetrically difficult for you to enact and enforce those moral judgments. So there's also this ironic, minute dimension, which is when your node downloads and syncs to the chain, performs an initial block download, the processor on your computer or your node, your Raspberry Pi, has to run and validate all these transactions to basically arrive at a check sig to verify that transaction is valid. Ironically, a block full of just financial transactions is more difficult generally to validate than a block full of inscriptions. This is because your node does not need to validate all that arbitrary data because it's not required to produce a valid check sig. It is easier for your node. It's actually easier for your computer running your node to validate a block with a bunch of JPEGs. So at a hardware level and a bandwidth level, it is both easier and indifferent. Okay, what if we do try to assign a morality to these JPEGs? And we try to say, well, we're going to try to prevent these transactions from propagating across the Bitcoin network because we're going to run a bunch of nodes and try to filter these transactions and kind of capture them. You can try to do that. However, Bitcoin is literally designed to prevent this from working. It's very important to emphasize that this is a foundational principle of Bitcoin that is very difficult, nigh impossible to filter valid transactions which want to pay fees. There's this tracker. We're tracking like what percentage of the overall reachable nodes are filtering nodes, not nodes, you will, and it's climbing. Went from 5% to 15%. Now it's 18, 19%. What percent do you have to have of overall reachable nodes for transactions to have a moderate difficulty getting into a block? There's not a lot of empirical examples until recently because nobody bothered to try to argue this because it's a dumb argument. Well, Orland Hoddle did a demonstration a couple months ago in Miami, demonstrating that at least 99% of nodes would have to filter these transactions in order for them to have a modest increase in difficulty getting into the next block. Even then, we have several examples, especially recently, of this being a meaningless and ineffective percentage. Most specifically, Peter Todd's Libre Relay Network, which is a network of nodes which peer to each other preferentially and have very relaxed standardness rules, specifically for large op returns. Peter confirms that there were maybe 30 of these of the overall network of reachable nodes, which exceeded 25,000. So 30 of 25K. And at the time, when this was still a novel, kind of nascent Libre relay network, these transactions were getting into blocks about a third of the time, paying no extra fees. Then we have the most recent example of sub 1 sat per vbyte summer. This is an interesting example because 100% of nodes on the network were filtering sub 1 sat per vbyte transactions. Again, 100% of nodes. These transactions were simply just being submitted directly to miners, at least initially. So we actually have a scenario where 100% of nodes in the network were filtering. And the weird thing is, it wasn't even because these transactions were paying more to miners. It was actually because the fee rate of Bitcoin, because there was so low demand, the fee rate was artificially being propped up fear is artificially inflated so that if a pool or a block producer were to defect from this artificial floor of fee rate, they could temporarily pocket more transactions, but cheaper transactions, and get a modest amount of increased fees. This creates an interesting game theory of cartel defection, which I won't get into. This could end up being a much longer conversation, which I won't get into. But that was funny because like it wasn't even necessarily that profitable. It was kind of an arbitrary market dislocation that where 100% of the nodes filtered, yet there was still demand for that transaction type. All I'm saying is, if the market wants to send a type of transaction, it will find a way.
Listen, if there's one thing the history of evolution has taught us, it's that life will not be contained. Life breaks free, it expands to new territories, and it crashes through barriers painfully, maybe even dangerously, but life finds a way.
Clever girl.
There's this claim from people who want to filter transactions that filters work because we have not seen a transaction of a certain type or of type X. Well, the response is probably there was not demand for that type of transaction. This is a really difficult claim to evaluate, but if this were true, that filters did work, we would expect to see filters creating those transactions, creating a scenario where those transactions have to pay a premium above the median fee rate at the time. And then they would decline in response. However, we have no evidence of that. So there's no evidence to support that claim. In fact, we only have evidence to say that this was simply just the market losing interest in that type of transaction. If you made it this far, I have one last point before we get into the fun riffing crash out stuff. And I try to think about this in the coded language that Bitcoiners love to use about first principles. And I make this argument. One of the big divergences in the debate appears to be that there's a large group of Bitcoiners who have a different set of first principles. And that one of those first principles appears to be that a monetary network like Bitcoin should not have JPEGs on it. When Bitcoin started having JPEGs on it, it violated one of their first principles. So they had to work backwards to create a new line of rational thinking instead of reconsider that their first principle was wrong. There are two first principles which are in direct conflict of one another: not having JPEGs and censorship resistance. Kind of like the letter analogy at the beginning. You cannot prevent arbitrary data fully, or at least it is a directly conflicting first principle with a censorship resistant network. The beauty, though, that I will say is that I do not believe Bitcoin is for JPEGs or data storage as its primary purpose. You can, because of Bitcoin's fee market, have functionally no JPEGs because JPEGs are very large transaction type. They cost a lot to produce. And if Bitcoin is to succeed as a monetary network, there is no way that like fun little collectibles and a sidecar of speculative assets can ever compete with a nation state or non-sovereign monetary network. A lot of people will reply, well, actually, we should discourage JPEGs in this network. So the thing is, I would agree. And the thing is, we have. When we have soft forked Bitcoin, there was discussion over the amount of arbitrary data that could be included in Bitcoin. We have argued about this. We have established a block size. We have established a fee market. Specifically, Taproot and SegWit were aware of the arbitrary data components and deemed not a risk, not a sufficient risk to Bitcoin because we have other components and disincentives. The reason JPEGs are on Bitcoin is because it is very, very cheap to use Bitcoin. And so the JPEGs have no competition. if they were to have competition, we would see them decline. And we actually have empirical data supporting this. I'll say that I myself was pretty conflicted about this during the early days of ordinals because I was there. And I actually had to I had to like go back to the basics to try to understand like where I stood on this issue. I was really conflicted in the first like couple weeks of February 23. But there was a really good post in the mailing list from Andrew Polstra where he says, unfortunately, as near as I can tell, there is no sensible way to prevent people from storing arbitrary data in witnesses without incentivizing even worse behavior and or preventing or breaking legitimate use cases. If we ban, quote, useless data, then it would be easy for would-be data storers to instead embed their data inside useful data, such as dummy signatures or public keys. Doing so would incur a 2x cost to them, but if 2x is enough to disincentivize storage, then there's no need to have this discussion because they will be forced to stop due to fee market competition anyway. He references a way of storing data in public keys, which BitMEX recently did a demonstration of. So I won't read the rest of his stuff. I recommend you read his, it's only 2 paragraphs. But there, I think I got through in 30 minutes, my monologue, and I appreciate you and the audience patiently struggling through this. Do you want to go to the drama part of the episode now?
Let's do it.
Okay. Here is where the fun begins. I made a thread. The most recent time that we had the crash out flare up in April, documenting some of the insane things people were saying. And as the most recent filters narrative spun up, it spun up because we had at our conference a presentation by Cetrea, a Bitcoin rollups company, presenting to some Bitcoin core developers. The core devs saw that Cetrea was using this one undesirable thing for Bitcoin. And they said, well, if companies like Cetrea are going to do this, then we need to relax standardness so that we disincentivize toxic behavior on Bitcoin. Cetrea did not ask for this. They just happened to be doing a technical demonstration. This caused a whole crash out on the Bitcoin Core GitHub repo discussing this change, which is the remove arbitrary limits on op return outputs. All hell broke loose. And we basically saw a bunch of people who didn't want this, who I would classify as the now filter movement, hop in to the GitHub issue or the PR and say, I knack. I do not acknowledge this. I do not want this. But the thing is, a lot of people think that this is literally like a vote system. A lot of people think that a decision for adding this code or this change to Bitcoin Core is literally just like a poll, but it's not. And especially because a lot of these people have never really used GitHub. They don't know the who's who of who's been doing the work, who's a subject matter expert on relay policy. If you remember, Jameson Lopp was then accused, because he supported this change, he was accused of having ulterior motives to promote his private company upon which he has which he is an angel investor, and that he's using Bitcoin Core and forcing them to make this change because personal gain and profit. And he was accused of not disclosing this, but he very much discloses this on a site, and he talks about it, and it's very clear that it's unrelated. This change would also not benefit that. This is the CTO of, not CTO. Yeah, this is the CTO of Oceanpool in this PR in April saying that if this PR gets merged, it's the end of Bitcoin and he will sell all of his Bitcoin. Well, the PR did get merged. And he says that he's gotten rid of his Bitcoin since then, if you can believe that. This is an actual tweet from Luke Dash Jr. saying that Jameson Lopp was rubbing this change, quote, in our faces, saying, quote, this is a literal quote, that Jameson Lopp fully intends to rape us being the node runners. He says they're literally committing violence against Bitcoiners. Now, I know internet discourse can be fiery and people can make broad claims and statements. Luke made it very, very clear that he means this literally, and he actually believes, quote, this is worse than rape. This is, I wish I could say this is like an uncharacteristic thing for him to say, but he says
it's pretty on brand.
He says these things all the time.
And that kind of frames the whole argument, though, because if you're approaching all of this with that in mind, then there's not really going to be anything that anyone can say that's going to rationalize JPEGs, inscriptions, etc., arbitrary data on the blockchain, right? Because you're already contextualizing that in your mind as being one of the worst things you can do to somebody. So,
yeah, but there's also this idea of consent. And I don't like having to belabor this topic. But
so
what is consent in the case of a node runner?
Yeah. And so this is another thing that I wanted to bring up when you were using an email address for the spam example. The way that I think that's tricky, and like that's the thing that usually gets brought up with the filter camp, is that to make that a perfect analogy, the actual inscription or the JPEG, transferring that to the email analogy, to make it a perfect analogy, that would have to be sent directly to the email address of the people running their nodes. So it's like you have the email address and then the email servers holding all the data. And then the analogy on Bitcoin is you have your address for your wallet, and then you have your node, which is storing all of the information. And so the reason why it's kind of tricky is because in this case, Bitcoin users, if they're running their own node, simultaneously are the recipients of transactions, but they also hold the data. So in this case, they're acting like the email service provider, right? Because they're actually holding the data for all the emails. But the thing that's annoying about that analogy to me when the filter proponents make it is like ultimately, to your point, the whole concept of consent here, it's like you're kind of consenting to running transactions that conform to Bitcoin standardness and to store them. And it's not really spam in the sense that you are not the target recipient. Also, spam is usually sent out by a malicious actor for reasons only to, kind of inflict some sort of harm or flood someone's inbox, mess with their bandwidth. In the case of this, the spam here are transactions that people are choosing to make because they think they can make money on it, because they're trading them. So they're minting NFTs, they're trading tokens, things like that. So to me, it's just not the same thing as someone just randomly shooting some crap to your email inbox. And again, also like they're not dusting your address. Like they're not sending small amounts of Bitcoin to your address. They're just mining. They're sending things to be mined onto the blockchain. So yeah, you may not want to store that on your node, but that's not the same thing as someone just sending something to you without your consent.
I would also say that this gets into the semantics. I'm willing to play ball on I'm willing to argue this point of consent because I would say that validating blocks is the consent. If you can choose to say that you do not consent by invalidating a block with transactions you do not like in it. This is, however, expressing that you do not consent with the Bitcoin network. So I would say that it is false based upon this semantic distinction that you are not consenting. I would say you can turn your node off, you can fork. Otherwise, you are consenting to these transactions. I don't even think that this is a very productive point to make, but because Luke insists, and this is a very strong point repeatedly made from the pro-filter camp, this is why I think it deserves a counterpoint. I'll also pull up this good blog from BitMEX, who I repeatedly reference on this topic, on just like what even is spam. Like, it's really difficult. There's a couple things which we can like define spam as. Spam is cheap and easy to send with no cost to the user. Spam can be different based upon the subjective theory of value. Now, I know Bitcoiners are going to crucify me for using the word subjectivity, but unfortunately, this is, I think, the most useful way to think about this. Quote from BitMEX: while images on the blockchain may seem spammy to many, we agree with the subjective theory of value. The value of various consumer goods and services does not reside objectively and intrinsically in the things themselves, apart from the individual is making an evaluation. This evaluation is a subjective matter that even he cannot reduce to objective terms or measurement. There have been, at the time, over $600 million spent on fees related to ordinals and inscriptions. That is not a negligible amount of money. These are fees that are outcompeting lower priced financial transactions. So I simply think, just by the raw amount of money which has been spent on these transactions, that it is really difficult to call them spam. They are a type of transaction which is very expensive, and that is not, and spam is not a good word to describe these. There's probably a better word, and I welcome people who want to try to come up with a better term. But like, I would almost say that just by definition, if something goes on Bitcoin, it's not spam. If we want to make like a really reductionist term here, and obviously this is not true like to every single transaction, but as a general rule, I would say people pay fees and therefore put something on Bitcoin, and to someone, it's not spam. So make that point. Yeah.
I think that kind of does it. If there's anything else you want to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, I will caveat that I'm very personally invested in this, and I am really reluctant actually to make this argument in this format podcast because I'm putting myself out there. I'm opening myself up to really, really visceral, hurtful attacks and accusations. It's really sad to see a major component of Bitcoiners do something which I believe objectively deteriorates Bitcoin and is almost indiscernible from an attack on the Bitcoin network and its anti-censorship resistant qualities. I wish all of the efforts were focused on a real solution to what they perceive as a bad thing on Bitcoin. And if you could increase adoption, then you would increase the fees on Bitcoin, which would decrease what you consider to be spam. The absolute best thing you can do is bring more people into Bitcoin instead of call them out for objectionable data. I will be inscribing WikiLeaks Afghan war logs and inscribing 3D printed gun instructions on Bitcoin, and I will be supporting protest art and freedom of information, because Bitcoin can function as a network which accomplishes those things. So I feel pretty strongly about freedom. I cannot say the same for the Knots camp.